left side. So good morning, everybody. Everything is set up now, so I can get started. So I'm here to talk to you about progressive enhancement and CSS. So just a little bit of an introduction to myself. My full name is Ire Elizabeth Aderinokun. Don't worry, you don't have to remember all of that. Although if you do, you can come and tell me and maybe I'll buy you a drink or something. But I typically just go by Ire. Or if you really want to be my best friend, I won't complain if you were to call me Ray. So I'm from Lagos, Nigeria. This is actually my first time here in Austria, and it's really cool. I've never been, and I got to explore the city yesterday. It was really amazing. So I'm a front-end developer and a UI designer as well. I currently work at a company called Ire, which is the company that makes AdBlock Plus browser and the extensions. And I'm also a technical writer. I write a blog, which is called Bits of Code, where I just write about anything to do with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is really what I'm the most interested in. I'm also a Google expert in web technologies. So my talk today is going to be, like I said, about progressive enhancement, but not the way you usually hear about progressive enhancement, because it's going to be about progressive enhancement and CSS. Oh my God, so crazy. So first of all, I'm just going to start with what exactly is progressive enhancement. And to get into that, I'm going to just go back to 2003, which is where the first concept of progressive enhancement was created. And this was actually the most popular phone at the time. It was the Nokia 1100, which is kind of a bit crazy how phones have completely changed. And this was the state of the web. So Safari just released its very first version. Firefox, which was then known as Phoenix, which is that really weird browser icon there, was previously known as Phoenix, as I said. And Internet Explorer was the biggest browser, and it was completely winning at the browser wars. It had about 95% of the market share. So they were feeling pretty good with themselves at that point. And the prevailing practice at the time was something called graceful degradation, which I'm sure you all know about. And it's basically just the practice of building your web functionality so that it provides a certain level of experience for modern browsers, which is usually the better level of experience. And it will also kind of degrade gracefully to a lower level of user experience for people on older browsers. And this is typically how it was executed. So if a user visits your site and they don't have JavaScript, you typically just wrap a little message in a NoScript tag telling them to go and download Chrome, because why are they even using a browser that doesn't have JavaScript? So a turning point came on March 11, 2003, and it was a turning point not that unlike Moses coming down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments. But instead of that, it was a guy called Stephen Champion, and he brought to us the commandments, which was progressive enhancement. So he gave a talk at South by Southwest at the time, and first of all, what he did was kind of outline what the main problems were with the whole concept of graceful degradation. So first, he noted that graceful degradation, it doesn't really straddle technology inflection points well. So it's really only about what we can do for whatever the current most popular browser is. It doesn't really look to the future. It doesn't really look to the past. He also said that a big problem is that many designers, when they're applying graceful degradation, they only kind of look at the current browser and then whatever was the previous version. So, I mean, the concept of graceful degradation wouldn't be such like a bad idea if people were thinking about it, not just about like the previous browser version, if they were thinking a bit further back than that. He also said that graceful degradation doesn't really address the different needs of different audiences. So apart from it being all about whoever is on the latest version of Chrome or whatever the hot browser is, they don't really think about people who are using it in different ways. So maybe people who have to use the browser using only their keyboard, or people who are using like a screen reader or something like that. He also said it's expensive to retrofit to new alternate devices. So as I mentioned, it's all about whoever's in the latest browser, but it also doesn't even think about new devices that are current but aren't necessarily the norm, so just new and different things. And finally, he also said that graceful degradation kind of gave us an excuse to just do whatever is good enough and not really try and do even more than that. And then he introduced the concept of progressive enhancement. And he said that web design needed to mature and accept the developments of the past several years. We can't just think about whatever is happening now. We have to remember that the web has a past, and there are people still on those older versions and older browsers. And he reminded us that the goal of web design isn't just to dazzle, it's not just to create a lovely website, it's to actually deliver information. If you think that people are going to the site like a BBC News, if people are going to the bbc.com, for example, they're not going to look at how beautifully it's designed. They're going there because they're trying to actually read the news. Okay, so then what does this actually mean in practice? And I'm just going to go over a few broad guidelines for how progressive enhancement should work. So the first thing is we should try as much as possible to make sure that basic functionality should be accessible to all web browsers. So this is just a very basic example. This is a site that people can go to kind of find a clinic that's nearby them so they can go and visit it, for example. So if you think about what's the purpose of this site, it's for people to be able to find clinics that are nearby them and to find that information. So no matter what browser your user is on, we have to try and make sure that that main goal of the site is still accessible to all those people. Second, we need to make sure that sparse semantic markup should contain all the content. And this is kind of two things. So the first thing is that we want to be using as semantic HTML as we can. So if we have a header, we should use the header element. If we have a footer, we should use the footer element. And when we have things like inputs, we have to make sure that they're labeled properly. The second part is that as much as possible, we want to make sure that the content of the site is defined in plain text in markup, because ultimately, that's going to be the most accessible format for everyone. So as much as possible, make sure that the content is just in markup, instead of having something like there's no markup and then you use JavaScript to actually insert the content of the page. A third note is that enhanced layout can be provided by CSS style sheets. And the key word here is that it's enhanced layout. So as much as possible, the site should actually be functional without any CSS at all. And CSS should be thought of as an enhancement rather than a requirement for your site to even function. So this is what that site could look like. It's very basic, obviously. Nobody wants their site to look like this. But the important thing is that it's actually functional. And if the user wanted to use it, it's actually possible for them to use it. Fourth, enhanced behavior can be provided with unobtrusive JavaScript. So again, the key word here is enhanced behavior, so that JavaScript isn't a requirement, it's more of an enhancement. So first and foremost, make sure your site works without any JavaScript at all. So this is just a basic example. So as I said, users are going to try and search for clinics in their area. So a basic feature could be that they just enter their postcode and then it fills out a regular form. But if the user does have JavaScript, we can enhance it a bit and make it a better experience by adding the feature for them to just use their current location. So things work without JavaScript, but you can provide an even better experience for users who do have JavaScript. And finally, we need to make sure that end-user web browser preferences are respected. So we need to make sure that the user can ultimately be in control of their own experience on the web. So I'm sure you might have seen something like this. It's kind of common for people to add tags like maximum scale 1 or user scalable no. And those are things you should really try and avoid, because you're really taking the control away from the user to be able to change, to view the site how they need. So they can't scroll, they can't shrink, and they might need that for whatever reason, and we shouldn't take that control away from them. So why is progressive enhancement important today? And obviously, the world in 2017 is completely different to when the concept was first created. And it's kind of just, we have like more of everything across the board. So we have so many more browsers. Even if you look at Chrome, for example, that has like 54% of the market share, that's not even close to what Internet Explorer had at the time. And on top of that, each browser has gone through so many different versions. So it's not just about supporting Chrome, for example. It's supporting, well, what version of Chrome are they on? Because your user, for whatever reason, might be on Chrome like 20 or something. And we have so many more tools. We all want to build the latest and greatest sites using React, Angular, or whatever that we want to use. And there's so many more people online. If you think about back in 2003, it might have been acceptable to say, oh, maybe only 0.5% of my users need to use a keyboard. So maybe it's negligible enough that I don't actually need to make my site very suited for that. But today, 0.5% of your users is not a negligible amount of people. And on top of all of that, the web is still a very open platform. It's not just for a subset of users, it's for everyone because everybody can access it. I'm sure you might have seen this infographic before, but basically it's just a report where they looked at different countries and saw how many hours of work people need to work for to be able to get just 500 megabytes of data. And if you look at like a country like Germany, for example, they only have to work 1 hour. So if they visit a site and for whatever reason it takes up 500 megabytes of data, that's obviously annoying, but it's not the end of the world. Whereas where I come from in Nigeria, that's 30 hours. That's like 2-3 days of full-time work. So it's no longer really negligible for someone like that. And to that kind of person, the way you choose to build your site actually matters. It's impacting their ability to pay for other things. It's impacting their ability to go and buy food or whatever. And if you think about the type of site you're building, if it was like the clinic's site, for example, that's a site that they will actually need to go to because maybe it's an emergency. And because the way you chose to build your site was maybe not exactly performant, then they just spent 30 hours trying to find that information. And we have to remember, as Bruce Lawson said, that we're building the World Wide Web, not wealthy Western web. It's not just for people in the West. So now I'm going to go into how to actually apply progressive enhancement. And first, I'm going to talk about progressive enhancement and JavaScript and HTML before I get into progressive enhancement and CSS. So what can go wrong with JavaScript? And there are basically two main things. So the most common one is obviously maybe JavaScript is not enabled in the browser. So maybe the user is on Opera Mini or something, or for whatever reason, they had to just turn it off. And the second problem is, even if JavaScript is supported, maybe they're on a particularly old browser, or the particular feature you're trying to use just isn't supported. And so how do we deal with this? So first and foremost, as I've said and said over and over again, is to just make as much as your website functional without JavaScript. So whatever the core feature of it, just make sure that people can use it. Another thing we can do is detect feature support. So if you're building a progressive web app, for example, and you're going to be using Service Worker, I'm sure you always see that, first of all, you just check to see if it's available before you start using it. And that way, things don't break for people who don't support it. We can even take this further and check if things are not supported, and then if it's possible, we can just use a polyfill to add that feature ourselves. So that's pretty simple enough. So progressive enhancement and HTML. So again, what can go wrong? And with HTML, it's a bit different, but basically what can go wrong is maybe you want to use one of the new HTML5 fancy new elements, and the browser just doesn't understand what the semantic meaning of it is. So for example, we want to define that that's a header, and this is the main part of our content. So we use the header and main elements. But because the browser is old, they just don't understand what you're trying to, the semantic meaning you're trying to convey by using those elements. So again, how do we deal with this? And what we can do is use things like ARIA roles. So we fill that information for browsers that don't already understand it. So for browsers that don't understand what the main element is, they'll still get that same information from the ARIA role that we've passed. Again, pretty simple enough. So now, what about CSS? So what's really the problem with applying progressive enhancements to CSS? So as we all know, CSS is a declarative language for describing the presentation of a document that's written in markup language. And as we know, its CSS declaration is made up of 3 parts. We have the selector, then the property, and the value. So what happens if something goes wrong with any of these elements? So we have this lovely image of Kanye laughing his ass off. And what we want to do is just rotate it 180 degrees. So what happens if we have like a faulty selector? So for example, here I've written image instead of just img. And as we can see, nothing happens. It's like I just never applied the style. Again, what happens when we have a faulty property? So here, instead of transform, I wrote transformer. And again, nothing happens. And then finally, what happens when we have a faulty value? Again, instead of 90 DEG, I wrote 90 degrees. Again, obviously, as you know, nothing happens. And even if we get all of that right, this is what happens in a browser if the user is viewing this in a browser that just doesn't support the transform property at all. So yeah, we know just nothing happens, like nothing breaks. There's no sort of fallback. There's just nothing happens. And this is a problem for 2 reasons. So if we compare it to JavaScript, we don't get any error messages, as I mentioned, and we can't really prepare for unsupported features and polyfill it the way we can in JavaScript. And unlike HTML, there's kind of no built-in fallback to the way it works. And this kind of makes debugging CSS kind of a pain, and things that we do have unintended effects, like we change one thing and something completely different changes. But there's hope. We can do a few things to this. So now I'm just going to go over a few of the today and historic solutions that we can use for progressive enhancement and CSS. So number 1 is obviously to start with sensible HTML. As I mentioned, HTML is the core of everything. So the ultimate progressive enhancement for CSS is to make sure your site just works without CSS at all. So don't do things like this where you have your HTML in a completely illogical way, and then you try to use CSS to correct it. So for whatever reason, you're having your main at the bottom, even though it should be the second. It's so much more simple, even for you as the developer, to just have your HTML in the most sensible way possible, because it makes writing CSS easier. And the less CSS you have to write, the better for everyone, right? And this concept was talked about in a List Apart article, where he talked about what they called the progressive enhancement M&M. So if you think about it, the content, the HTML, is thought of as the core, which is the most important part. And then you have the presentation, which is like the chocolate wrapper, which is nice, but it's not, again, the core. And then JavaScript is like the wrapper after that. Another thing we can do is take advantage of the cascade. As we know, CSS is cascading style sheets. And what we can do is kind of build rules on top of each other, and each rule almost like a progressive enhancement on the other. So for example, if you want to use something relatively modern, like a linear gradient, not all browsers are going to support this. So what we can do is define some sort of fallback before that, and then add the enhanced or the more modern version after. So nothing is going to break or nothing is going to be missing for a user who doesn't support the linear gradient. They're taken care of by having that kind of fallback. Another thing we can do, or this is also how we use vendor prefix rules. So we always want to make sure we use the unprefixed version at the very bottom. Okay, the slides are going crazy. We always have the on prefix version at the bottom, so that that's the one that will be used. And as browsers implement things, that's the one that we want to be used. So another thing we can do is implement a mobile-first strategy. Using min-width-based media queries are always going to be better than using max-width-based media queries, because mobile styles are generally just more adaptable than desktop styles. So if you think about something like this, if you style an image perfectly for a desktop, it's just going to be completely unusable on mobile. But if you style it perfectly for mobile, sure, it's not going to be amazing on desktop, but at least it will actually be usable, rather than the other way around. So this is just an example. Mobile styles are generally more responsive anyway, so it's better to have the kind of fluid style and then build on top of that with a desktop style, rather than the other way around. Another thing we can do is use Flexbox and CSS Grid. And these were really designed to be a progressive enhancement, and this is because of the way they work. So, for example, this is a Flexbox example. If you want to have an element that will have its children both vertically and horizontally centered, we can do it the old way, which is like display table cell and vertical align middle. But we can also do it the Flex way, which is nicer. And what will happen here is all the styles related to the old version will be completely overridden, and they're not going to interfere in the way you might think. So it's not going to be like the vertical align style is going to interfere with our flex styles. And this is very well supported. So yeah, this is one chart where Opera Mini is actually green. So you should use Flexbox. And although, unfortunately, not on CSS Grid, but coming soon. So a very last resort you can do is to separate your style sheets. So depending on how far back you have to support, you can, as a very last resort, just kind of have a separation of concerns. So the BBC spoke about this in a technique that they called cutting the mustard. And the way it kind of worked was they did feature detection on the browser, and they started with a base, and then they tried to detect if this was a modern browser. And then if it was, they were now like bootstrapped with more modern styles. And it's all about finding a balance between doing what's right for the user, but also making sure your code isn't going to be completely unmaintainable. My time is almost up, so I'm just going to speed through a bit. But, so I'm sure you're asking, because you might already know, what about feature queries? And these kind of allow us to do what we could do in JavaScript by saying, oh, if service worker in navigator, then do this. And so the way it works is using the supports tag, which kind of works like media queries. So what we just do is you can detect if a feature is supported. So you can say if display effects is supported, then apply it. It can also work in other ways. So we can chain things, we can do either or we can even detect if it's not. It's pretty perfect, right? And yeah, it's very well supported. Oh, another thing where Opera Mini is actually green. And how can we use it today, given that not all browsers actually support it? And John Simmons wrote a really good article about it, even back when it wasn't as well supported as it is now. And you just took this example, and so here we're trying to detect if object fit cover is available, and then we apply it. And there are kind of 4 scenarios that we need to think about here. So here's a scenario where the browser does support feature queries, and they also support like the object fit cover, which is obviously what we want, so that works well. Similarly here, if the browser supports feature queries, but they don't support the feature we're concerned about here, that works the way we want to as well. And this scenario is where the browser doesn't support feature queries, but it also doesn't support the feature. So for example, Edge browser doesn't support feature queries, and it also doesn't support object fit cover. And you might think that this is a bad scenario, but ultimately what we want is for that CSS block not to be applied, and that's in fact what will happen. So that works fine. So the only scenario which we actually have to worry about is here, which is like Safari 7.1 or something, where it doesn't support feature queries, but then it actually does support object-fit cover. And that's a scenario where we would actually have wanted the CSS block to be applied, but it won't be applied. And so what's the solution for this? And I'm sure you can guess what it is: progressive enhancement. So what we just have to do is look at feature queries as a progressive enhancement themselves. So an example of this is just have some kind of fallback that we're completely comfortable with, and only have the feature query as an enhancement on top of that. So what about the world in a few years? And as you can imagine, it's going to be even more of everything. We're going to have so many more browsers, and we're not even going to know what type of browser is going to be. Like, are people going to be viewing your website through VR goggles or through like their smartwatch? And we're going to have so many more technologies. And every time I give this talk, I just increase the number. So now we're on like 320. And we're going to have so many more people online. And these people aren't going to all be coming online with the latest, whatever iPhone it is at that time. They might be using the equivalent of a Nokia 1100. So we have to just remember that the web is still going to be for everyone. And as much as possible, we should leave no one behind. Thank you.